Welcome to Trust the Code, the Alkebuleum podcast exploring African digital sovereignty, identity, institutions, and the future of trust.
And we have a really fascinating deep dive for you today.
We really do. So I want you to imagine something for a second. Imagine you spend 10 years building up this flawless, completely unblemished business credit score.
Right, like never missing a single payment.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You establish these ironclad supplier relationships, and then, you cross a border to open a second branch in a neighboring country, and poof, that entire reputation is just completely erased.
It resets to zero.
It resets to zero. And that's the frustrating reality for millions of entrepreneurs in Africa today. But what if that trust could be mathematically guaranteed?
That scenario really gets right to the heart of what we are analyzing in this deep dive into the Alkebuleum white paper, specifically version 2.0.
Right, because for the better part of a decade, the global conversation around technology in Africa has really fixated entirely on access, hasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's always been about handing out smartphones or laying down submarine fiber optic cables, just, getting citizens online.
Which is important, obviously.
Well, sure, it's important, but access has a ceiling. And the core mission we are looking at today is that Africa does not only need digital access, Africa needs digital ownership.
Yes.
And true digital ownership, it really begins with owning the trust layer of the economy.
And so today, we are looking at the blueprint for exactly that. Alkebuleum is essentially a Layer 1 public permissioned blockchain.
Built by Africa for Africa.
Exactly. Built by Africa for Africa and its global diaspora, serving as the continent's sovereign digital trust infrastructure.
And to really understand the sheer scale of that ambition, I think we first have to define what trust infrastructure actually means mechanically.
Right, because it sounds like a very abstract economic concept.
It does, but it is literally the invisible engine of every modern society. I mean, we're talking about the foundational databases that allow strangers, businesses, and governments to transact securely.
So things like identity registries.
Exactly. Identity registries, land titles, credit bureaus, court records, payment rails. When these underlying systems function smoothly, capital flows and citizens prosper.
Because they can undeniably prove who they are and, what they own.
Right. But when they don't function, the friction is just staggering. It's like trying to build a skyscraper on sand.
I love that analogy. Building an economy without a trust layer is literally building a skyscraper on sand. And the white paper really grounds this in everyday administrative nightmare.
Oh, the examples are so relatable.
Yeah.
Like if you graduate with a software engineering degree in Ghana and you try to secure a job in Kenya.
Right. The current system essentially requires you to wait like 6 weeks. You have to send a dozen emails, navigate this absolute labyrinth of bureaucracy.
All just to prove you passed a math class in 2018.
It's wild.
It is. And it's because the record keeping across much of the continent is just fundamentally fragmented. You have these deeply entrenched paper-based systems.
Which are obviously highly vulnerable.
Completely vulnerable to physical loss or manipulation or, local corruption. And even in jurisdictions where systems are digitized, those databases are usually siloed.
Right. A server in Lagos does not automatically communicate with a server in Accra.
Exactly. So you get these incredibly weak verification processes across borders.
The Liberia land title example in the text illustrates this danger perfectly, I think.
Well, that's a great example.
Yeah, because if a land title exists only in a physical ledger in some specific municipal office, it can literally be altered with a pen or just permanently lost if the building floods.
Right. And you cannot effectively collateralize an asset to secure a business loan if the local bank isn't 100% certain you actually hold the unencumbered rights to that property.
And the downstream effect of that ambiguity is that the cost of capital just skyrockets.
It has to.
Yeah.
If a lender or an investor cannot verifiably prove what is true, what is owned, or what is owed, they're going to price that ambiguity into their risk models.
Or they just simply refuse to lend at all.
Exactly. And that is the hidden tax of a missing trust layer.
Okay, so I want to play devil's advocate here for a second on behalf of our listeners.
Go for it.
If the core problem is that we have a bunch of physical filing cabinets that need to be digitized or siloed servers that need to connect, why can't Africa simply utilize the highly advanced digital platforms that already exist?
Like using existing tech giants.
Yeah, exactly. Why are we building a brand new Layer 1 infrastructure from scratch instead of just, licensing enterprise database software from foreign tech giants in Silicon Valley?
That is the crucial question. And it really comes down to the geography of technology. and the alignment of incentives.
Okay, unpack that a bit.
Well, if you look at the vast majority of global digital platforms, and even the most prominent public blockchains, they are architected in Silicon Valley or Switzerland or Singapore.
Right.
And those developers build systems that solve their local regulatory or economic realities.
Mm.
And then they market those platforms outward to the rest of the world, including Africa.
So relying entirely on foreign-controlled digital infrastructure leaves the continent dependent on systems where they basically hold no governance rights.
None at all. And where the economic incentives do not naturally align with African development goals.
You are essentially renting the foundation of your economy from a landlord
Who doesn't even live in the building.
Exactly. And who can change the terms of the lease at any moment.
And for a continent of 1.4 billion people, that is a profound vulnerability. The digital future of Africa absolutely must be owned by Africa.
Which is reflected right in the network's name, isn't it?
It is. Alkebuleum is derived from Alkebuleum, which is one of the most ancient indigenous names for the continent.
Translating roughly to Mother of Mankind or Garden of Life, right?
Exactly. So the phrase built by Africa is not just some marketing slogan in this context. It is a structural prerequisite for security and economic self-determination.
Okay, before we go deeper into the architecture of this, I want to clarify a really essential parameter for you listening.
Oh, I know where you're going with this.
Yeah, because when we discuss a layer 1 blockchain in this deep dive, we are completely divorcing the conversation from the whole crypto circus.
100%.
We're not talking about speculative token trading or yield farming or meme coins.
Not in the slightest.
Yeah.
This network is engineered strictly for verifiable civic and economic utility. It's about replacing vulnerable registries with cryptographically secure, mathematically verifiable truth.
It is pure institutional infrastructure.
Exactly.
But I'm still stuck on the sovereignty claim, actually, because the white paper specifies that Alkebuleum utilizes the Ethereum virtual machine, or the EVM.
Yes, it does.
So if the ultimate goal is absolute digital independence, aren't we still relying on a technological standard created elsewhere? I mean, if the underlying code environment is maintained by developers in the West, how does Alkebuleum guarantee sovereignty?
That's a really sharp pushback. But we have to separate the execution standard from the consensus ledger.
Oh, okay, how so?
Well, using the EVM is structurally similar to a sovereign nation deciding to standardize the width of its railroad tracks to match international norms.
Ah, okay. The standard gauge analogy from the source.
Right. You adopt the standard gauge so that global train cars can run smoothly on your rails, but adopting that universal width does not mean you surrender your border control.
Or your customs policies.
Exactly. Or your national sovereignty over what actual cargo travels on those tracks.
So the EVM essentially just acts as the standard gauge.
It does. It means African developers can write in Solidity, which is the most widely used smart contract programming language.
Without having to learn some proprietary isolated language just to build on the specific network.
Right. They get to leverage world-class, battle-tested global tooling, open-source libraries, and existing developer talent.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So sovereignty is maintained where it actually dictates the reality of the network.
Yes. At the consensus and governance layers, the EVM executes the logic, but it does not decide which blocks are true, and it does not govern the protocol. That authority is entirely owned by Africa.
Which naturally begs the question, who exactly holds that authority?
Right.
If Alkebuleum is a sovereign network, who is actually stamping these blocks as true and maintaining the ledger? Because the architecture is described as publicly verifiable, but permission in its validation.
So the transparency is absolute. Any citizen, any investigative journalist or enterprise can read the ledger and audit the state transitions.
Okay.
However, the actual computation, the act of producing blocks and confirming the truth of transactions, that is strictly restricted to approved entities.
And this is achieved through PORA.
Yes. Proof of reputation and authority.
I really need to understand the actual code-level computation here, because this feels like a massive departure from traditional blockchains.
It's a complete paradigm shift.
Because normally in a proof-of-stake network, anonymous nodes simply lock up capital to validate transactions, right?
Right. In an anonymous network, a validator's only skin in the game is the capital they have staked.
But here, we are talking about named institutions acting as validators.
Exactly. Central banks, commercial banks, major universities, government ministries, regulators, and diaspora organizations.
That is just fascinating. So how does that change the dynamic if they try to cheat?
Well, if an anonymous node proposes a fraudulent block, the protocol just slashes their token balance. It's purely financial. But PORA entirely flips that paradigm by computationally weaponizing real-world credibility.
So the network literally inherits the physical reputation of its validators.
It does.
It is easy to say their public trust is destroyed, but how does the protocol mathematically enforce this? Like, say a university node attempts to alter a ledger entry to fake a degree for a corrupt politician.
Think of it like a computationally enforced, extremely high-stakes VIP poker game, where your seat at the table is your entire institutional charter. If that university node attempts to propose a state transition that alters a degree fraudulently, the smart contracts governing PRA recognize the invalid state.
And the other institutional nodes in the network cryptographically reject the block.
Exactly. But the protocol doesn't just dock a token balance. It mathematically revokes the malicious node's validation permissions, permanently ejecting them from the consensus layer.
Wow.
And simultaneously, it broadcasts the cryptographic proof of their malicious intent to the public ledger.
So the entire continent instantly sees, undeniably, that a specific university attempted to forge a civic record.
Yes, and the real-world consequence is catastrophic. Employers instantly stop accepting any credentials from that university. International accreditation bodies revoke their standing.
And if a central bank attempted fraud, they would lose regulatory credibility globally.
Right. The cost of cheating mathematically guarantees honest behavior. Because attempting to steal $100 at this digital table costs you $1 billion institutional reputation.
So the institutions Africa already trusts in the physical world are computationally bound to act honestly in the digital world.
Precisely.
Okay, so with central banks and ministries securing the network, what are the actual tools and protocols they are deploying to empower citizens? Because the white paper outlines 3 foundational suites of smart contracts,
Let's start with the identity protocol.
which relies heavily on zero-knowledge cryptography, right?
It does. It prioritizes privacy by design. So let's consider a standard business loan application today.
Okay.
To prove your business revenue exceeds a certain threshold, you are usually forced to hand over months of raw bank statements.
Which exposes your suppliers, your profit margins, every daily transaction to a third party.
Right. It is a massive data privacy risk every single time you need to prove a single fact.
So how do zero-knowledge proofs on Alkebuleum fix that?
You can present a cryptographic token that mathematically proves the statement, "My revenue exceeds $50,000, is demonstrably true, without ever revealing the underlying financial data.
That is incredible. So it's like a digital passport where you can cryptographically prove you are over 18 without ever showing your actual birth date.
Exactly. The citizen or the enterprise retains total sovereignty over their raw data. You prove what needs to be proven and nothing more.
Which feeds directly into the second pillar, the institutional records protocol.
Right, which extends that exact same cryptographic proof to real-world anchoring.
This is where those institutional validators issue the tamper-resistant certificates, like a Ministry of Health issuing a medical license.
Or a university issuing a degree. The issuing institution signs the record cryptographically, and the citizen holds control over the disclosure of that record.
So when a doctor applies to practice at a hospital in a neighboring country, the hospital just requests verification.
And they instantly receive the mathematical proof that the medical license is authentic and has not been revoked.
We completely eliminate the forged paper certificates and those weeks-long verification delays we talked about earlier.
Yes.
Let's bring this back to the entrepreneur and Legos we mentioned at the very beginning of the show, because the third pillar is arguably the most economically transformative, the credit protocol.
It really is. The lack of portable credit history is one of the largest structural barriers to capital expansion in Africa.
So what literally happens on the Alkebuleum network to make her credit portable when she wants to expand to Nairobi?
Her localized credit history, her consistent loan repayments, her utility bills, her tax compliance in Nigeria, all of that is anchored as a privacy-preserving, verifiable credential on-chain.
Okay.
So when she approaches a commercial lender in Kenya, she grants them cryptographic access to verify that proof.
And the Kenyan lender trusts the credential not because they trust her local Nigerian bank.
Right, they trust it because the credential was validated by the distributed institutional nodes on the Alkebuleum network.
Wow. So her financial reputation transforms from a siloed domestic file into a borderless digital asset.
It becomes universally portable. And these are not just theoretical mechanisms, by the way.
Right. The white paper outlines active, real-world applications currently being deployed, like the anti-corruption infrastructure pilot in Liberia.
That's a huge one. They're anchoring public procurement and disbursement records on-chain.
Because consider how corruption in public procurement actually operates mechanics-wise.
Right. It usually involves tampering with the bidding timeline or altering invoice amounts after a contract is awarded.
Or just conveniently losing the paper trail entirely.
Exactly. But if you anchor every step of a government contract, the bid submission, the timestamp, the payment disbursement on an immutable ledger overseen by independent institutional validators.
Then backdating a contract or inflating an invoice becomes computationally impossible.
It really does.
The text also details supply chain provenance use cases, which I found fascinating. Tracking a shipment of cobalt or cocoa from the exact point of extraction all the way to the export harbor.
Because you can mathematically prove that ethical labor practices were observed.
And simultaneously ensure that the tax revenue and economic value are captured by the jurisdiction where the value is actually created.
Rather than being lost to middlemen and intermediaries.
Right.
And zooming out to the macro level, none of these protocols or pilots operate in a vacuum.
No, they are intricately aligned with the institutional architects of Africa's future, specifically the African Continental Free Trade Area, the ACFTA.
Yes, and the AU's Agenda 2063.
The ACFTA represents a $3.4 trillion combined GDP. I mean, we are talking about the largest free trade area in the world by number of participating countries.
It is massive. And integrating the economies of 54 sovereign nations is a monumental logistical challenge.
Because you are dealing with disparate customs agencies, border tariffs, conflicting regulatory compliances.
And totally fragmented payment rails. You cannot facilitate seamless continental trade using paper ledgers or siloed national databases.
It's just not going to scale.
Exactly. Alkebuleum is positioned to provide the neutral, mathematically verifiable substrate that allows those 54 nations to coordinate securely.
Without any single nation having to surrender its sovereign data to a neighbor.
Precisely. And the roadmap laid out to achieve this reflects a highly deliberate, phased approach.
We are currently in phase 1, right?
Yes. Mainnet is live, and institutional onboarding is actively taking place as central banks and universities join the Validator Council.
And the architecture scales all the way to phase 4, which targets full continental coverage across all 5 African regions.
And eventually the transition of governance to a fully decentralized Validator Council. Building trust infrastructure cannot be rushed. It requires meticulous engineering and deep institutional buy-in.
Well, this is just the beginning of our journey in this deep dive. For you listening, in our future explorations, we will be looking much closer at the granular mechanics of African digital sovereignty.
We'll be examining the specific code that enables institutional transparency.
And tracking how cross-border economic coordination really evolves on this network.
But before we wrap up, I want you to consider a completely different angle on the implications of this technology.
Oh, lay it on me.
Well, throughout this discussion, we have really focused on Africa gaining independence from foreign digital infrastructure.
Right.
But imagine the global landscape a decade from now, when 1.4 billion people and their respective institutions are utilizing this mathematically guaranteed trust layer to verify identity, credentials, and credit.
The sheer economic gravity of a market that size.
It will force Western tech monopolies and global financial institutions to adapt their own legacy systems to interface with Alkebuleum's standards.
Oh, wow. That is a staggering paradigm shift.
It is. For the first time in modern history, the flow of technological influence could reverse. Africa will not just be consuming global digital standards, it will be exporting its own sovereign blueprint for institutional trust to the rest of the world.
This is why Alkebuleum begins with trust. Because before finance, before trade, before digital government, and before continental integration, there must be a foundation people and institutions can verify.